did want to say, I want to give you the floor, Laurent, to tell us something about the theses of the book as you imagine them. But let me say, one of the things that struck me, in addition to it's the charm and wit of the book, and as I was saying to you before, one of my favorite moments in the book is on page 54 when Laurent explains to us that at Sciences Po, you were taught to divide everything into two parts. No matter what the subject is, you divide it into two parts. And that's some kind of intellectual regression from the Rudon, where you're taught to divide everything into three parts. Anybody who knows people who graduate from both places recognizes the truth of this. But in many respects, Laurent, if I may, before, to get you started, this book is in a sense, I don't want to say a polemic, but it's certainly an investigation about French education and about the educational system in France. And one of its striking originalities is that the very thing that many people in France, or those of us who admire France, think of as one of the key of France, one of the great positive goods of France, that is the system of elite education, you see as part of what's wrong with France. You see it central to what is not working in France. And I wonder if you'd give us, that's an original take, and I wonder if you'd give us a sense of why you think that and how you think the problems it creates for your country.
Sure. Let me first thank you, Adam, for being here tonight. Thank you for a very kind introduction, and the French American Foundation for organizing this event. And all of you for braving the traffic restrictions and so on, being here. One word about the title. Yes, I have exactly encountered the same type of criticism. Not surprisingly, even people who have been journalists who reviewed the book favorably, well, at least the title should have been a French title. Others, of course, said, this is another pro-American thing and the French bashing. And so I got my share of that. But I always favored provocative titles. My first book, 30 years ago, was called Le droit sans l'État, Law Without the State, and there was some kind of theoretical heresy. How can you conceive of law without the state? But that title, caught the interest, and I like provocative titles. Why this particular title? It is really the question that Francophiles in this country and elsewhere, people who lived in France, who love France, have been asking me time and again, what's wrong with your country? Why is it going downhill like this? And so this short book is really my answer to this question. That's why the title is actually in quotes. That's the question that people have been asking me. And before getting to your very important point about education, I'd like just to briefly state what the central thesis of the book is. So I've been, beyond the usual answers about, high unemployment, slow or no growth, the rise of populist parties, the usual list of troubles. My goal was really to try to identify whether there is a common thread underlying all these troubles, and a common thread that would be specific to France as opposed to other European countries who also have their own crises. And I thought the answer was yes. And the answer has to do with globalization. Every poll for now several years show that the French have a problem with globalization generally. And so I think the problem lies with France's difficulty to adapt, to adjust to the challenges of globalization. But that's also a fairly known fact. My question is, why is that? Why is that? And my answer, and that's really the central point of the book, is that I think that is because globalization in a broad sense, not only economic globalization, but also the geopolitical consequences, the cultural consequences of globalization, the technology revolution, all of that, so the changing world, if you will, is challenging the very core of the French model of what made French excellence in the post-war period and even before that. And it's because those very sort of pillars of the temple are being challenged that the crisis is so deep. So what are just a few examples of those pillars? First, obviously, the centrality of the state and the sanctity of politics in French life. Second, and connected with that, is the traditional high quality of the French political class and the senior civil service. Third, the meritocratic system, and we'll come to that in a minute, the educational system, the grandes écoles and all of that. France's global intellectual leadership, France's influence in Europe and in the world. All of those things that defined French excellence are, in my view, being challenged more deeply than other countries in Europe or in this country, obviously. And that is why there is this sort of multifaceted crisis. So that's, and then the book sort of develops in each of these areas how globalization directly or indirectly challenges this. Now, coming to your question, and I'm grateful because it is also at the center of the book, the meritocratic system. My point is that obviously France has had and still has to a large extent a very good educational system, public educational system. Certainly, primary school and high school, but also in higher education. And despite the split between the universities and the grandes écoles, which has its own problems, France has an excellent higher educational system. But things have changed in the past 10 years or so. First, there is global competition for higher education. That is, a bright high school student in France has a choice of going to the Grande École or to going to study abroad, whether in the United States or in Switzerland or in Canada or in other countries. There's an open global market for education, and students can travel. So that's one sort of challenge. But the bigger challenge, the deeper challenge, has to do with the role of the Grandes Écoles in the French system generally. The Grandes Écoles were created, and that really applies to the whole the whole book, at a time for a homogeneous society that was structured around a strong state in a world of nation states. And the problem that France has today is that society, that state, and that world no longer exist. And particularly when it comes to the elite schools, it was good to pick the best brain, the best talents of the nation to basically make them civil servants, to go serve in politics, government, state-owned enterprises, everything that had to do with the states. Now, of course, globalization and liberalization and internationalization has reduced the prerogatives of the state. And at this point in time, we see that the motors of growth, of innovation, have to do with other skills, other qualities than what is being taught in the Grande École. And so what we have now is a huge machine to essentially create civil servants. That's what the French system is about. And whether these people stay in civil service or even if they go to the private sector in business, they keep that same mentality, that same mindset. That is being a fonctionnaire, even being a functionary of the state or for a large corporation, of Total, or it's the same mindset. That is, you're not personally committed, you're not personally engaged. I speak because I've been through that, and you sort of always distant from what you're actually doing. You're not trying to create, to innovate, and your sort of belonging, your networks are more about your former classmates or whoever you were with in some, government position or political parties. So there are all these networks that really don't have much to do with anything creative or growth producing or job producing. And so if you look at this in a sort of a macro sense, it is a huge cost, opportunity cost for the country to maintain the system.
Yes, as I understood the book, is exactly as you put it so well, Laurent. You're saying is that one of the things that happens is that if you have a statist cast of mind, it doesn't matter whether you're in the state or not, you tend to see things in that way. I once wrote about a certain exasperation with the higher French education system, which creates what I call a parallel paper universe in which people inhabit for their entire lives. And it's in that parallel paper universe that everything takes place. And no matter what it is, and I once gave the trivial example of a fonctionnaire at France Telecom who had the necessary ribbons for a fax machine directly behind her head, but could not find them on the manifest, and therefore they did not exist. They did not exist on the list, they did not exist in the world. Trivial example of a broader endemic thing. But can I try out another side of that? Let me be more Catholic than the Pope, and I will be more pro-French than the French. Do we not risk it in that way? Is not one of the great gains of that you have a genuinely, truly highly educated elite political class who are able to run the state effectively even in the absence of political leadership? Let me give you an anecdote. Is not evidence, we know that, but if I may share a quick anecdote. I was in France a little more than a year ago writing about the crisis of the Roma in France, and I wanted to interview Manuel Valls, who was then Minister of the Interior, and I was put in touch with one of his adjoints, and I was knocked out by how knowledgeable, literate, on top of it, that he knew exactly what the New Yorker was in a way that his equivalent in Washington would have had no idea about what Le Monde was or what it represented in France. Was broadly cultured about the crisis of the Roma and where it came from, the range of it. Now, it's perfectly true to say the only reason that he would speak to me was because I knew someone who had been at school with him, right? So I was able to enter into the cohort, not by knocking on the door, but by asking a friend to make a phone call. I recognize the truth of that. Is that not, in some ways, an enormous positive to have a class of people who are, in effect, running the government where that highly cultured and literate? Is that not positive? And if I may put that in a broader orbit, Laurent, is that not, in any case, definitive of France? In other words, to ask you sort of the big global question, because much of what you're saying here is that in the new globalized economy, which rewards the Googles and Amazons of this world and does not reward the old apparatus of the nation state, France lags behind. That's what the matters with France. Is that a reasonable transformation to demand? Is France not, in a sense, a Colbertian state no matter what happens to it, and that its triumphs and disasters will both always come from what are, after all, very, very deep cultural traditions?
The problem with Adam, his questions are so relevant and so it's hard to.
Well, let me break it down.
No, I appreciate it. So let me say, first of all, that we're not talking about throwing the baby with the bathwater, obviously, and things are relative. But I would say two things. First, on your first point, I think what you described was true until about 15, 20 years ago, or at least it was more true than it is today. In other words, I think there has been a downgrading of the French political class and administrative elites. And that's part of the problem, I think. The first chapter in the book, which, by the way, exists now in English translation on Amazon. So you can.
Where else, right?
Yeah, right. Well, U.S. publishers take too long to. But anyway, so it exists with the same English title. The first chapter of the book, I would say, it's called "It's the Politics, Stupid." In other words, I think that the primary thought for French immobility in the past 20 years, and that's really my time frame, 95 to now, is really the fault of the French political system and political elite. And that political elite has, for a number of reasons that have to do with globalization, has sort of lost its prestige, its aura, but also some of its expertise. In the 60s, 70s, even the 80s, a great career in senior civil service would lead to politics, where people came with a real expertise in finance, in a number of other areas.
The generation of Giscard.
Generation of Giscard, right? You might call them technocrats, but I mean, they were very, very competent, and they had a broad internationalist vision and all of that. Whereas people of this generation of politicians don't have that. They don't have any economic or business experience. They often gone to politics straight out of school. There's a figure of, in the 2012 legislative election, about 40% of the new elected representatives had done nothing else in politics. And that's the Hollande generation. I remember that you quoted that we were on a bus to the south of France with the French-American Foundation, the Young Leaders Program. And I remember very well François Hollande was on the phone most of the time with probably some socialist party. He was talking politics the whole time. And that struck me. I still remember it.
Already at that
Already.
moment.
And I said, why is he not enjoying anything? He was on the phone talking about French politics. So, but that's a generation that's gone to politics very early. At the same time, a lot of people who would have been senior civil servants have left for the private sector in the 80s and 90s with globalization and privatization and the realm of the states shrinking. So all these factors have produced, I think, a lowering of the quality of the political and administrative elite. So, of course, it remains probably better than in many other countries, but it's no longer what it used to be. Now, your second point
was about even allowing for the degradation. Is it realistic to try and think of reforming what has been a Colbertian state for 400 years? And
yeah, I think it is realistic. I think it's necessary because I don't think France can maintain its status in today's and tomorrow's world if things don't change. And I think things are changing. If you look at the younger generation, there are many more entrepreneurs, innovators. A lot of young people don't want to work at Total or at Société Générale. They want to, they prefer creating their startups. Some people go abroad and they may or may not come back, but it really doesn't matter. So there's a change, and I think France needs, cannot stay. It has to maintain obviously the best possible public service and all of that, but essentially too much of the elites produced by the educational system are still going into this machine, this administrative machine, and that share has to diminish in favor of entrepreneurship, innovation, scientific research, and all of that. I think it's possible.
No, it's not an accident. I think that your tale, in a sense, begins in 1995. That's where a crucial year.
Right.
I was living in France at that time, and I think we all can remember. Anyone who was there can remember the manifestation, the social revolt.
The 3 weeks of walking around Paris in the snow,
right, exactly,
without transportation. Yeah.
And at that point, as you remember, it was 6 months after the election of Jacques Chirac and the installation of the Juppé government, and the government, in effect, surrendered to the street at that moment, didn't try to make fundamental reform, and that set off what, to my eye at least, was 12 years of stagnation, of immobilism in every sense. Why is it that not only that moment took place, but that the possibility of reform every time someone puts it forward seems to be met by a popular revolt, not merely a revolt of the elites, but by a popular revolt? Why does that happen, and how can that change?
Well, that's a key question. I guess probably the fact that the strike lasted 3 weeks was already a big effort on the part of the Juppé government to try to hold, to resist. But after that, I think that there are a number of reasons. First, the sort of this kind of street revolt and demonstration are really part of the French political culture still since the French Revolution, and it's really deeply ingrained in the culture. There's also the fact that the state, that so many utilities are still state-owned or state-controlled, and so the trade unions have this huge power to block things. And then there's also a lack of political courage. And I think that's, again, we're back to the sort of, if the politics stupid, there's been a consistent lack of political courage both on the right and on the left for different reasons. I mean, so you see the left, it's part of the Fonds de Commerce, and the right, it's a part of sort of clientelism that caters to this group or that group. And it's a very corporatist country, state. It's a very conservative country. And that's why reform really requires bold political courage. So Sarkozy, was supposed to do that when he was elected in 2007. That lasted a little while, but again, that thing was sort of watered down and then stopped. So for the past 20 years, we've had really immobility. I mean, if you look at the first, you talked about the first Chirac mandate, then Chirac was re-elected thanks to Jean-Marie Le Pen, and instead of doing something with his 82% of the vote, even if it were artificial, he didn't do anything. Sarkozy, there was some hope there, some impetus, but then and then Hollande, so we've I think wasted 20 years, and that's in today's world it is really a leap backwards because you're not.
Could you come back for a second, Laurent, to, I know your vision in this book is more global than personal, than political, but I am still fascinated by the failure of Sarkozy. We understand Hollande ran on a program of immobilism. Let's not change anything, basically. Right. Sarkozy ran on a program of radical reform, whether one is on his side politically or not. That was what he ran on. It's what he seemed to have a mandate for. And yet, France seemed to resist, indeed the right seemed to resist a program of radical reform. What are the mainsprings of that resistance on the right, as you feel?
Well, I think first of all, the part of the problem is that the right-left divide is really has become completely artificial. In other words, the real divide in the political spectrum is really between, I don't know how to translate this in English, it's ouverture and fermeture, so openness to the world, to globalization, to Europe, to immigration, to the market economy, and fermeture. And that divide is really
innovation and tradition.
Innovation and tradition, all this. And that divide runs within the right and within the left. So even though Sarkozy was, there was part of the right that really did not go along with that. And there was part of the left that would have gone along. And so until the political landscape can be restructured along this true divide, which it can't because of the institutional, the electoral thing, because every party has its own electoral base and all of that, but the institutional and electoral system also prevents that. Until there is this realignment, you're going to have a very hard time finding a consensus for reform, a majority for reform, because that would be part of the right and part of the left. And so I think that's the explanation. And then Sarkozy, I think, made a number of personal mistakes, tactical mistake, and also stylistic mistake. I'd say he heard some of the French, image of the presidency and so I think he wasted some good substantive ideas by those types of mistakes. And so there was really a waste to some extent.
Another aspect of French life, when you're asking what's wrong with France, that you critique in the book Laurent, is French intellectuals. It's the French tradition of the mastermind and the master thinker. And one of the things you point out is that in your view that the current generation of thinkers, of intellectual leaders, philosophers, call them penseurs, is as with the political class, but the intellectual class has declined in quality as well, and that in a country that depends on ideas as much as France does, that's a significant wound.
Yes, I've been simply asking myself, where are the Foucault, where are the Barthes, where are the Lévi-Strauss, where are the of today, and I don't see them anywhere. We do have Canames, Piketty, thanks to the US, thanks to the Americans have become. But where are these intellectuals? And so I think that there are two reasons for this, and it again has to do with globalization. One is simply the fact that France as a country, as a nation, in today's world has simply lost the aura, the influence that it has. I mean, to some extent, Camus was much more a global writer than his equivalent today.
So more global brand, one might
Right.
say.
Yeah. Right. So, and that has to do with simply the language, the fact of not being able to use sort of a global media, even for journalists, for columnists. I mean, it's obviously easier if you're writing for the New York Times than if you're writing for Le Monde, because you don't have the same global platform. So there's an element of simply the medium, if you will, and being able to use a global medium or not. But then there's something deeper than that. I think that there's been a shrinkage of French public life, simply. I mean, you can see that certainly at the political level. People are much more inward-looking and provincial, frankly, parochial. But same is true for French intellectuals who write mostly about France. And
not to interrupt Laurent, but I was struck by that last, and I wrote about this last fall, when there was the great fuss about Zemmour's book, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that was striking about it is it's an insanely insular book. It's about, it's totally opaque. It's not about the global challenges that confront us as thinkers. It's about the narrow ghetto of French life.
Yeah, and that's even, thinkers that are obviously better and broader than Zemmour, but they either write in reaction to that, but it's always about France. And since France itself is inward-looking and obviously less interesting and less universal than it used to be, it's kind of a spiral, and if you add that with the sort of the medium issue that I just discussed, that there is a loss of relevance and therefore a loss of leadership.
Well, the medium issue, the linguistic issue, is one that's always fascinated me. It's not one you go into in great detail in this book, but it is one that I think is worth thinking about. That is if not the disappearance, then the diminishment of French as a universal language, as an international language. Surely that's part of it. I did want to at least speak up for my friends amongst the French philosophers a bit. It's a point you make in here too, but I thought I would challenge you on a bit, and that is that many of the great masterminds you've just cited and you referenced in the book, after all, were hugely sympathetic to totalitarian strains of thought and to things, whereas at least the generation that I know, they happen to be my friends, but that's Pascal Bruckner, Bernard Lady.
I grant them that.
Yes,
I
you
grant
grant
them
that.
that.
Are essentially, in the Americans, that's liberal thinkers. They respect and cherish pluralism, democracy. They're suspicious and hostile of totalitarian systems and so on.
I agree, and I grant them that. But at the same time, they, I mean, apart from Sartre, but others had some, sort of really deep.
Aron.
Aron. But even if you go beyond the political sphere, the Barthes, the Lacan, the Foucault, the Derrida, they were not talking really about politics, but they were leading.
They changed consciousness.
And I don't see that today.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think Pierre Bourdieu was the last of that kind, who had that sort of influence in the world.
And it may be that you have to do it differently in today's world. I mean, that's what I think publishing in English, being willing to sort of tour the world and all that. I mean, you have to do this today, and if you don't, then you don't have the same kind of influence. You're also competing with emerging markets, with thoughts are coming from all over the place, not only the U.S. or the West. So it's the rules of the games have changed, and so And I think the French system is not really favorable to that kind of internationalization of production of ideas.
And some another point you make in the book, of course, is that the American tradition, which is now also in another way present in Great Britain, of the great research university, is not one that is naturally does not receive a hospitable place in France. Let me turn things again. Playing devil's advocate or more Catholic than the Pope here. How do you respond? Because there's a certain move, and you mentioned Piketty, but for instance, Paul Krugman, our Nobel Prize-winning columnist and professor, one of his constant themes is France gets a bad rap. That in fact, France is in better shape than Great Britain. That France is. I'm sure you've encountered this line of reasoning that the liberals in the French sense overrate the crisis in France because it serves their purposes, that in fact France is doing better than we're prepared to allow. How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I often disagree with Paul Krugman's column, but on that I think it's really wrong. I don't think that many French people today, apart from diplomats or public officials, would disagree to think that the country
no one's telling the truth about it.
Yeah, that the country really has some serious problems, and so it doesn't mean that it doesn't have tremendous assets also, or that it's nice to live in France, that we have still a very good educational system, we have a great healthcare system, even though it's kind of on the verge of bankruptcy, but it is
spectacular.
Yeah. So it's not a matter of saying that there are not some great things in France, or France doesn't have the resources. I think it does. That's why I wrote this book. I think, but we just need to prevent ourselves to make better use of this strength, these resources, in a way that's no longer a model of a homogeneous society around a strong state in a world of nation state, because that's gone. And so the issues about immigration and all of that are already
right. Yeah. That's a natural place I wanted to raise. You talk about the French model of education and of the state are based on an essentially homogeneous nation state. If anything is clearly transforming in France now, it's that. Not long ago, with Pascal Bruckner, I did a conversation at Dartmouth about immigration and assimilation in France. Obviously, a very crucial question right now. Do you see that as a crisis or an opportunity? In other words, will what now seems like a major problem, does that hold some of the seeds to transformation in France?
Well, I mean,
I'm thinking of the Islamic presence in particular, but more broadly, the new generations of immigrants. Right.
Yeah, well, I guess if you're talking about what's called today the migrants, the people arriving from Syria and Iraq.
Right. I was thinking more of families who have been in France.
Right. Well, France obviously has not been a great success story in terms of integration. Obviously, that's a understatement. And it's interesting that the current migrants, when they have the choice, they choose Germany or the UK. But I think it could be an opportunity to change the view. Obviously, France and Europe in general needs immigration simply for demographic reasons. And I mean, Germany has understood that very well, but I think it's a problem. It's a Europe-wide problem.
The population is aging.
And there's a need for new blood. So it may be that this new migrations will kind of transform a little bit, and also the post-Charlie debates. Obviously, I mean, a lot has been written about this, but I was struck. But the fact, the whole debate about Charlie, I mean, the reaction was obviously great, the demonstration and all that, but after the fact, there's still, a strong view that even in a sort of multicultural and multi-confessional society, you could still insult the prophet, or I mean, in the name of laicity and secularism. And at the same time, you asking the Muslim community to actually, affirm more clearly, its adhesion to the French Republican values, but at the same time, we think it's normal to we don't draw the line between what may be offensive to the faith in general and what is really more sort of radicalism or terrorism. And so all these contradictions, I think, have to do again with the difficulty to adjust to a new sort of ideological model where the French public ideology was about an abstract citizen that was equal to all others, where all differences were eliminated. You practice your religion at home, but you don't go out with it, and all of that. But in today's society, this is no longer, and not only in the French society, but in the sort of global public ideology promotes, diversity, promotes sort of actual equalization of differences, which require recognizing those differences in the first place. If you don't recognize those differences as a matter of law, then you cannot. So
you don't regard communitarianism as a curse word.
No, I don't. I think you cannot ask the Muslim community to stand for if you don't recognize it as a community.
Mm-hmm.
So there's all these contradictions that France is grappling with to sort of go from one model to another, and we're in the middle of it, and that's why these debates are interesting.
I know we want to turn the conversation over to our audience if we can, but can I just ask you, Laurent, if you would, because as we were saying before, this is not just a book of complaint and indictment, it's a book about reform.
Right.
Could you tell the audience, if you could, that if you became president tomorrow, or you could speak to the man who will, or woman who will become president tomorrow, to choose two reforms that you see as fundamental and capable of reversing the trends you're diagnosing, what would they be?
Okay, I think the first one, which is the enabler, and even though a lot of things are happening within society, but would be still to sort of change the political system so that a consensus for reform can emerge in this sort of openness. Have to find a way to have a majority in favor of reform, and that would take some of the right and some of the left. That's the sort of kind of a threshold thing. But on the substance, I think two things. One, back to education, your first point, I think and it has to do with primary school as well, even though we have good primary school, public school, but we need to change the mindset. We need to teach kids, to be more open, to be more creative, to be more critical, to all those things that the US is really good at, and that really sort of challenge authority, try new things, have teamwork, all those things that are obvious in the US, but where the French are really not good at. And then that goes, beyond having a less, early selection, being able to decide what your profession is going to be, not at 17, but at all those things all the way, and obviously the elite school and the defunctionalization. I can use that word. All right, so that would be, and then the second thing would be provocative, but I think France has to really get back to work. I think we need really to, if we want to create growth and create jobs, we need to lift all the impediments to economic activity, work, and all of that. And there's a very, very timid attempt to sort of reform the labor code du travail. The labor code is very, very shy. There's all this debates about working on Sunday. But I think that's critical. But here again, part of the population either doesn't believe that growth can come back, or that it's desirable. That there's all this thing about zero growth society, and so growth is no longer a consensus item. So
economic growth. Yeah.
Economic growth.
Yeah.
Economic growth. So if you don't have that, it's very hard to actually lift the obstacles.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there's still some ideological obstacles.
But Adam, if you have another question.
No, I was just going to say, it sounds as though what you think is the core thing, and something to look forward to, is that some kind of growing union between, so to speak, the liberal side of the right,
Right.
and the European side of the left, the
Right.
open Europe side,
Right.
into a new kind of coalition.
Right.